Welcome back to another episode of Rock Boys Football. Mike Norvell, Florida State, working their way through spring practice. And Saturday morning, I believe we get our first spring scrimmage from this Florida State program. And Mike Norvell, Tony White, Gus Malzahn, pretty transparent with the media after the scrimmage in terms of what we're seeing from this football team. A couple of standouts we got to talk about. And I think, secondly, just kind of some storylines to continue to monitor for this Florida State program as we work through spring practice. It's been really fun talking this program in spring ball. You got not only a ton of new faces from a personnel standpoint. I think the biggest storyline for Florida State going into 2025 is a completely upgraded coaching staff highlighted by Gus Malzahn and Tony White, who I personally believe are some of the better coordinators on both sides of the football that you see in the country. I think Florida State was working with a pretty dang weak coaching staff over the last couple of years. Big fan of the coaching staff going into 2025, and that is, pretty big storyline to monitor as we go through spring practice. Now, the thing that stood out to me the most here was this was a long and competitive scrimmage. 120 plays from Mike Norvell and Florida State. Why do I think that is? I think for a couple of different reasons. Hey, we got brand new coaches. We got brand new football players. We got to figure out in spring, who our guys are going to be going into 2025. And there's no better way to figure out who your playmakers are than go out there and compete in some scrimmages. And you're seeing Florida State do that during spring ball. Now, I want to get into some intriguing names that we continue to see pop up, talk about some storylines that I think are intriguing as well. Now, before we do it, as always, a quick shout out to the Florida State fans. Many of y'all know I've had a blast talking this football team the last couple of weeks. The amount of support that y'all continue to show to the fellas, it means the world. Appreciate you guys. If y'all do enjoy the content, consider subscribing to the channel. Without further ado, let's get into it. And I want to start at the quarterback position. Now, there are two storylines that we have to talk about. Now, one includes Thomas Castellanos, but I want to start with true freshman early enrollee Kevin Sperry. Seemingly every time I go to read about what's going on with Florida State in spring ball, Kevin Sperry's name's getting brought up. Now, I don't think Kevin Sperry is going to start for Florida State in 2025, but that is a very intriguing name to monitor over the next couple of years where Kevin Sperry didn't have the national media and the kind of Florida State fan base attention that a guy like Luke Romanoke did last year. But Kevin Sperry is a guy, he's a gamer. There's a reason Oklahoma took his commitment when he was a sophomore in high school. He's not the biggest name coming out of high school. I certainly do not think he starts for Florida State in 2025. File that name away because it seems like he is really adapting to the college football game really quickly with Florida State. Now, Thomas Castellanos, the presumed starter for Florida State going into 2025, the biggest thing that I am getting, and both Mike Norvell and Gus Malzahn have talked about this, he's a guy that can create at the quarterback position. You talk about the biggest drop-off in quarterback play that I think Florida State saw from Jordan Travis to DJU it was a lot of things, obviously. I think the biggest one was DJU's inability to make things happen back there. Obviously the offensive line wasn't very good. And when things break down for a quarterback like DJU, the play's dead. You're taking a negative play. There's really no playmaking ability from a guy like DJU. Now, Thomas Castellanos, you hope the offensive line is better than it was in 2024. I think it certainly is from a personnel standpoint. But at the same time, you want a quarterback that can go out and create. And it doesn't have to be perfect for Thomas Castellanos every single play for him to have some success. And that's the kind of quarterback he is. Now, Tony White was talking about it too in terms of, look, it's difficult when you go up against a quarterback like Thomas Castellanos, even if you dial up a blitz or you win up front, that's sometimes not going to be enough for a guy like Thomas Castellanos. I think that aspect of his game and really just the amount of different ways you can use him, specifically in the Gus Malzahn offense, that should excite a lot of Florida State fans. And it's the same way we've talked about him since he committed to Florida State. He's not going to be a top 10 pick in the NFL draft. But in terms of a quarterback that if you build an offense around him that suits what he can do, there's zero doubt he can have success. We've seen him have success. Go back to 2023. in an offense that was built for Thomas Castellanos to be successful, he was very difficult to deal with. I mean, just out of Florida State fans, y'all remember Thomas Castellanos in 2023 being a difference maker. That excites me in terms of what we're hearing from Thomas Castellanos. Now, the second storyline is the impact that Luke Pettibon is having on this offensive line. Because one of the concerns, if you have now from a personnel standpoint, Florida State's clearly better on the offensive line, right? Micah Pettis, 3-year starter in the SEC going in to be a 4-year starter. Gunnar Hansen from Vanderbilt, same thing. 3-year starter in the SEC going into year 4. Luke Pettibon, really good center. We know what Richie Leonard is. We know what Adrian Medley is. These are all guys that we know are good football players. The concern you might have is, can it come together? These are all new faces that have never played a lick of football together as a unit. Luke Pettibon is not only, in my opinion, your best offensive lineman. He's an all-conference center coming from Wake Forest, but you heard Gus Malzahn say this. Luke Pettibon's a guy that we can lean on in terms of meshing this offensive line together. He's an extremely smart football player. He's getting the calls right in the scrimmage. It's one thing to have the personnel right on the offensive line. It's another thing to have this offensive line play together as a unit. Specifically, Luke Pettibon not only being a really good football player, but being a really smart football player, bringing this group together. I think that's a massive, it's kind of one of those sneaky storylines. It's not something that I think the national media is going to talk much about, but I mean, if you're a good offensive line, you have a center that is a general out there. And I think that is what Luke Pettibon is for this Florida State offensive line going into 2025. Last intriguing storyline is, hey, and Gus Malzahn was vocal about it. We ran the football a lot in this scrimmage. And why are we doing that? One, because that's the Gus Malzahn offense. Like we're going to run the football a lot on Saturdays in the fall. But secondly, we got to figure out who our guy is at running back. Now, if you all been rocking with the fellas for the last couple of weeks, this was one of the bigger question marks I had going into spring practice where, look, we got a couple of running backs that we like. But we got to figure out who's going to be the workhorse because you go back historically with Gus Malzahn, he's a guy that is going to ride one back. It is historically not really a committee. Now, you might see a committee from Florida State because I don't know if a running back will separate themselves, but that's kind of a storyline that I'm monitoring. Is it Cam Davis? Is it Roydell Williams, who's generating a lot of buzz again going into 2025? I'm very intrigued to see who is that running back that emerges. To me, it's between Cam Davis and Roydell Williams and Jalen Lucas. Sounds like he's a difference maker. I believe had an explosive touchdown this morning, but he's not going to be a guy that goes for 25 carries a game. He's just not built like that. I believe 172 pounds. Who emerges? Really interesting question to monitor on the offensive side of the football. Now, going to the defensive side of the football, there's a couple of things that I think stand out. Most notably, and it's the same storyline that we heard last year, but we kind of saw it towards the end of the year. The Florida State fans that kind of stuck true and watched, all 12 games last year, you saw Darrell Jackson start to put it together. This is a kid that there's nobody, I shouldn't say nobody. They ain't a lot of guys that are built and have the capability that Darrell Jackson has. And he is going to be arguably the most important football player on this team. Because you go back to Tony White at Nebraska, who were the two most important football players for that Nebraska defense the last 2 years? It was Nash and Ty Robinson. Your two big bodies on the middle of the defensive line. If this 3-3-5 defense is going to be successful, you need dominant play from Darrell Jackson. And the good thing is he's a dominant human being who has the potential to be a dominant football player in the 2025 year. To hear Darrell Jackson is progressing, to hear the new coaching staff identify Darrell Jackson as a guy that is putting it together, I think that's about as good of news as you could have hoped for coming out of the spring scrimmage. KJ Sampson getting a little buzz too. A guy that we liked out of high school. It's been taking a little bit to kind of get his feet under him at the college football level. Hey, the more the merrier in terms of depth in the middle of this defensive line stepping up. We know what we have with Darrell Jackson. Can Kevin Wynn be that guy? Can KJ Sampson be that guy? Can Daniel Lyons be that guy? You got to be a deep defensive line, and I think Florida State's starting to have some of that depth emerge. Elijah Herring buzz. Look, and this is just kind of my opinion here. Is Elijah Herring going to come in and be a first team All ACC linebacker? No, probably not. We haven't seen that level of play from Elijah Herring over the last couple of years, whether it was at Tennessee, whether it was at Memphis. But it's not really why Florida State brought him in. We brought him in because we need help at the linebacker spot. We need guys that we know can play at a power four level. And Elijah Herring sounds to be that guy. And he's kind of emerging as one of the leaders of this Florida State defense, which I think is important, especially when you talk about that linebacker position, kind of having the green dot, getting the plays in. That's a really intriguing storyline. And then lastly, I think the secondary is really, really good. And look, Florida State addressed every position outside of the secondary in the transfer portal. I think that was for a reason. Hearing great things about Jabril Rawls, hearing great things about Quandarius Jones. You're hearing really good things about Earl Little Jr., which should excite a lot of Florida State fans because Earl Little Jr., the sky's the limit for that kid. Like we know he can be a really good football player. It's just about him putting it together. And this is the year that we've kind of started to hear some of that buzz from him, which I think is exciting as well. I'm confident in the secondary for Florida State going into 2025, and that's probably going to be a position that the national media might have question marks about. You lose Fentrell Cypress, you lose AZ Thomas. How good is this secondary going to be? I think it's going to be pretty dang good. And you're kind of hearing that coming out of spring ball. That's all we got from this scrimmage. Again, a lot of storylines to unfold. I think my biggest question mark moving forward is who steps up at that wide receiver 3 position. You haven't heard a ton of buzz from anybody yet. We know what we have with Squirrel White. We know what we have with Deuce Robinson, who's that third pass catcher. It is probably the thing I'm looking forward to hearing the most. Appreciate you guys rocking with it. If y'all do enjoy the content, consider subscribing to the channel, and we'll talk to y'all later. Peace.